We already told everyone we're moving into the beach house this summer, my mother said as she lifted her wine glass across the dinner table like the decision had already been made. My father smiled beside her, slow and satisfied, while my younger cousin let out a soft laugh like this was some harmless family joke. I sat perfectly still, my fingers resting against the stem of my water glass as the noise of the restaurant faded into a dull hum around me. The candlelight flickered against the white linen tablecloth. Somewhere behind us, dishes clinked softly, and an old Frank Sinatra song drifted through the speakers. But all I could hear was my mother's voice repeating those words in my head. We're moving into the beach house. Not, could we stay there for a while? Not, would you mind if we visited more often? No. They had skipped straight past asking and landed on ownership, the same way they always had my entire life. The upstairs bedroom gets the best morning light, my father added casually while cutting into his steak. I already told Harold I'd finally have a place by the ocean. I looked down at my plate, even though I had lost my appetite 20 minutes ago. The grilled salmon sat untouched beside roasted potatoes growing cold under the restaurant lights. My mother noticed and sighed dramatically. Evelyn, honestly, you should be happy your parents will enjoy the place instead of letting it sit empty all year. Empty. The word hit harder than it should have. That house was not empty. Every corner of it carried pieces of a life I had spent decades trying to earn for myself. The pale blue shutters I picked after driving 3 hours along the Gulf Coast searching for the right paint color. The small reading chair near the upstairs window where I planned to drink coffee every morning while watching the tide roll in. The seashell wind chime hanging beside the porch that made the softest sound at sunset. None of it was empty. It was the first thing in my life that truly belonged to me. Mom, I said quietly, keeping my voice calm. I just bought the house 3 months ago. Exactly, she replied immediately. You don't need all that space by yourself. A few people at nearby tables laughed at something unrelated, and somehow that made the humiliation worse. It made the moment feel public even though no one was listening to us. My father dabbed his mouth with a cloth napkin before leaning back in his chair. Your mother already started looking at golf clubs nearby, he said. There's a nice retirement community 10 minutes from your property. Your property, not mine. Never mine in their minds. I felt something cold settle quietly inside my chest. Across the table, my cousin Melissa suddenly avoided eye contact, pretending to study the dessert menu instead. She knew. They all knew this conversation was wrong. But families like ours survived on silence. No one interrupted. No one defended the person being steamrolled. My mother reached for her wine again. After everything we sacrificed for you growing up, I think a beach house is the least you could share. There it was. The sentence I had heard in different forms for nearly 60 years. After everything we sacrificed. The invisible debt that never stopped growing no matter how much I gave back. My first nursing paycheck at 22. The down payment I helped cover when my father refinanced the house. The weekends spent driving them to appointments while working double shifts at St. Mary's Hospital. None of it ever counted because in their minds, I still owed them more. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table and offered a small smile that surprised even me. You're right, I said softly. I should prepare properly. My mother's face brightened instantly. See? I told your father you'd come around. I nodded once. Calm, controlled, quiet. The exact version of me they had trained their entire lives to expect. But something had shifted tonight. Something final. Because for the first time, I realized they did not see me as their daughter. They saw me as an extension of their comfort. Their retirement plan. Their obedient little solution to every inconvenience in their lives. Dinner continued around me after that. My father started talking about fishing charters while my mother debated where to place her antique china cabinet in my beach house living room. My beach house. They spoke about it openly now, measuring rooms they had never even stepped inside. I barely said another word for the rest of the evening. I simply smiled when expected and listened while they redesigned my future without permission. But later that night, after I drove home alone beneath the warm Florida sky, I parked in my driveway and sat inside the car for nearly 10 minutes without moving. The neighborhood was quiet except for distant crickets and the rustle of palm trees in the humid evening breeze. Then slowly, I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and called the only person my parents had always underestimated more than me. Mark, I said when the line connected. I need your help protecting my house before my parents try to take it from me. Mark Sullivan answered on the second ring with the same calm voice he had used for the past 20 years whenever life cornered me into difficult decisions. "Evelyn," he asked carefully. "It is almost 10:30. Is everything all right?" I looked through the windshield at the dark outline of my small suburban home and tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "No," I admitted quietly. "I do not think it is anymore." There was a brief silence before I heard papers shifting on his end. I imagined him sitting in his home office wearing those reading glasses that always slipped down his nose. "Tell me what happened." By the time I finished explaining dinner, my throat felt dry and my chest heavy with exhaustion. I repeated every detail exactly as it happened. My mother discussing furniture placement in the beach house. My father telling friends they were retiring there. The confidence in their voices. The certainty that none of it belonged to me. Mark let out a slow breath. "Have you given them keys?" "No." "Have they ever stayed there alone?" "Not yet." "Good," he said immediately. "Keep it that way." I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. Outside, a warm Florida breeze moved through the oak trees lining my street. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once before the neighborhood settled back into silence. "I think they are serious," I whispered. "They are," Mark replied. "And people like your parents do not usually see boundaries unless someone finally puts one directly in front of them." I swallowed hard because deep down I already knew he was right. The problem was that I had spent my whole life avoiding conflict with them. I learned early that peace in our family came with conditions. Agree quickly. Do not embarrass them. Do not say no too loudly. Growing up in Savannah, Georgia, appearances mattered more to my parents than emotions ever did. Our front lawn stayed perfectly trimmed even when the electricity bill was overdue. My mother hosted church luncheons while criticizing me quietly in the kitchen 5 minutes earlier. My father shook hands warmly with neighbors while reminding me afterward that daughters were supposed to be useful, not difficult. Somewhere along the way, I became very good at disappearing inside my own life. "Evelyn," Mark said gently, pulling me back into the present. "You still there?" "Yes." "Listen carefully. If they are already speaking publicly as though the property belongs to them, this can escalate quickly, especially at their age." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean residency claims, mail forwarding, extended stays, establishing themselves as dependent occupants. It happens more often than you think, especially with family properties." A cold feeling spread slowly through my stomach. Suddenly, every comment at dinner replayed differently in my mind. The golf clubs, the retirement plans, my mother discussing where her china cabinet would go. They had not been fantasizing. They had been planning. "I worked 43 years for that house," I said quietly. "I know." His voice softened. "That is exactly why you need to protect it now before emotions get tangled up in legal confusion." I finally stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward my front porch while holding the phone against my ear. The porch light cast a pale yellow glow across the flower pots lining the steps. I had not watered the hydrangeas in 2 days. Their petals drooped slightly in the humid night air. "Do you remember the first time you mentioned buying a beach house?" Mark asked suddenly. A small smile touched my face. Before I could stop it, "At Daniel's retirement party. You said your dream was a quiet porch, coffee at sunrise, and absolutely nobody asking anything from you." My chest tightened at the mention of my late husband. Daniel had understood me better than anyone else ever had. Even during the difficult years after his cancer diagnosis, he used to sit beside me at night scrolling through real estate listings along the Gulf Coast. Small white houses with sea grass in the yards and weathered wooden decks facing the water. "One day," he would say softly, "one day you are going to wake up somewhere peaceful." After he passed away 3 years ago, I almost gave up on that dream entirely. Grief made everything smaller. Smaller mornings, smaller holidays, smaller versions of myself moving quietly through empty rooms. But then last spring, after selling the family home and finally retiring from nursing, I drove west along the Florida coastline alone. I stopped in a tiny beach town called Seabrook Cove and saw the house by accident. Pale blue shutters, white porch railings, a narrow path leading straight to the sand dunes behind the property. It was barely 1,500 square feet, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt something loosen inside my chest for the first time in years. I could breathe there. "Evelyn," Mark said carefully, "people who spend decades controlling someone do not react well when that person finally builds a life beyond them." I unlocked my front door slowly, and stepped into the dark, quiet house. So what do I do now? There was another pause. Then his voice became calm and precise again. First, you do not panic. Second, you do not argue with them yet. And third, he said, you let me help you make sure your beach house stays yours. 2 days later, I drove to Seabrook Cove before sunrise with a travel mug of coffee balanced carefully in the cup holder beside me. The highway stretched quietly along the Gulf Coast while soft pink light slowly spilled across the horizon. Usually that drive calmed me. Usually the sight of water appearing beside the road felt like stepping toward a different version of my life. But that morning, tension sat heavy in my chest the entire way there. I kept replaying dinner in my mind. My mother discussing my beach house as if she had personally chosen the paint colors. My father talking about retirement plans without ever once asking what I wanted. By the time I crossed the small bridge leading into town, my stomach already felt tight with dread. Seabrook Cove looked exactly the way it had the first day Daniel and I discovered it years ago during one of his treatments in Tampa. Small white storefronts, palm trees swaying gently beside narrow sidewalks, elderly couples walking near the marina with coffee cups in hand. The kind of place where life moved slowly enough for people to remember each other's names. I turned onto Ocean View Lane and immediately noticed a silver sedan parked in my driveway. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I knew that car. My mother's church parking decal was still sitting crookedly in the back window. For several seconds, I simply sat there staring at it while the engine idled softly beneath me. Then I looked toward the house and felt something inside me sink. The curtains upstairs were open. I had left them closed last weekend. One of the porch chairs had been moved near the front door. My father's fishing hat rested casually on the armrest beside it like he belonged there. I parked slowly along the curb and stepped out into the humid morning air. The ocean breeze carried the smell of salt and sunscreen from nearby properties already preparing for the weekend crowd. Normally that smell made me smile. That morning it only sharpened the knot in my chest. As I walked toward the front porch, I heard voices inside. My mother laughed softly at something. A cabinet door closed. Then my father said, "This room would look better with darker furniture." I stopped at the front door and stared at my own reflection in the glass for one long second before unlocking it. The moment I stepped inside, my mother appeared from the kitchen holding one of my coffee mugs. "Oh good," she said brightly. "You are finally here." Finally. As though I was the guest. I looked around slowly. The blue throw pillows I bought for the living room sofa were gone. In their place sat floral cushions that looked exactly like the ones in my parents' den back in Savannah. A stack of unfamiliar magazines rested on the coffee table. Near the hallway, 3 large moving boxes were lined neatly against the wall with my father's handwriting across the sides. Winter clothes, garage tools, kitchen supplies. I felt my pulse begin to pound quietly in my ears. "What is this?" I asked carefully. My mother waved one hand dismissively before sipping coffee. "Just a few things we brought down early. It makes more sense than hauling everything later." My father appeared from upstairs carrying a measuring tape. "The guest room closet is smaller than I expected," he muttered before finally noticing my expression. "What?" I stared at him in disbelief. "You brought boxes here?" He frowned immediately, almost offended by the question. "Well, obviously. Your mother and I are not getting younger, Evelyn. We need stability." Stability. Another word that somehow always translated into taking something from me. I walked toward the kitchen slowly, trying to steady my breathing. On the counter sat a grocery bag filled with food I had not bought. Orange juice, yogurt cups, my father's favorite wheat crackers. Beside the refrigerator, my mother had already hung one of her embroidered dish towels over the oven handle. Tiny signs of ownership. Tiny little flags planted all over my life. "You should have asked first," I said quietly. My mother sighed dramatically and placed the coffee mug into the sink. "Why are you acting so defensive? We are family." Family. The word wrapped around every boundary they had ever crossed. Family meant obligation. Family meant surrender. Family meant I was selfish anytime I wanted something for myself. I turned toward the back porch before I said something emotional. The sliding glass doors opened onto the small deck overlooking the dunes behind the property. Seagrass swayed gently beneath the morning breeze while waves rolled steadily against the shoreline beyond. For a moment, I closed my eyes and listened to the water. Daniel would have hated this situation, not because he disliked my parents. He tolerated them politely for decades, but because he always saw the version of me they created. Small, careful, constantly apologizing for existing. One evening years ago, after my mother criticized the curtains in our first home for nearly 20 minutes straight, Daniel took my hand after they left and said quietly, "One day you are going to stop asking permission to live your own life." At the time, I laughed it off. Standing there on that porch now, I finally understood what he meant. Behind me, the screen door slid open. My father stepped outside holding the measuring tape again. "I was thinking," he said casually, "once we officially move in, we could build a small storage unit near the side yard." I looked at the ocean for another long, silent moment before finally turning back toward him. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty about what I was planning to do next. My father stood on the porch beside me studying the side yard as though he was already drawing up construction plans in his head. The morning sunlight caught the silver in his hair while the breeze lifted the edges of his polo shirt. At 88 years old, Richard Carter still carried himself like a man who expected the world to move around his decisions. "A storage building would fit nicely over there," he continued casually, pointing toward the edge of the property near the dune fence. "Nothing too large, just enough space for tools and fishing equipment." I looked out toward the ocean again instead of answering him. Waves rolled gently beneath the pale blue sky, while seagulls circled lazily over the shoreline. A couple walked their dog farther down the beach, leaving footprints in the wet sand behind them. It should have been peaceful. It should have felt like home. Instead, I felt like a visitor standing inside someone else's plans for my future. "Evelyn," my father said impatiently. "Did you hear me?" "I heard you." He studied my face for a moment before shrugging. "You always overthink things." That sentence followed me through most of my life. I overthought things when I cried after my mother forgot my birthday dinner because she was hosting church friends. I overthought things when my parents borrowed money from my nursing school savings and never paid it back. I overthought things when they missed Daniel's chemotherapy appointment because my father wanted help reorganizing his garage instead. Somehow my feelings always became inconveniences instead of warnings. My mother stepped onto the porch carrying her coffee mug. "Oh, honestly, Richard, leave her alone for 5 minutes." She turned toward me with that familiar tight smile I knew too well. "You know your father gets excited when he finally feels appreciated." Appreciated. The words settled heavily in my chest. That was the language they always used when asking for sacrifices. If I gave something up willingly, I was loving. If I hesitated, I was selfish. My mother sat carefully in one of the porch chairs and looked around approvingly. "This place really is perfect for retirement," she said softly. "Quiet. Safe. Better weather for our joints." Then she glanced at me over the rim of her coffee cup. "And frankly, it makes more sense for us than for one woman living alone." There it was again. The quiet implication that my life somehow mattered less because I was alone. After Daniel died, people started speaking to me differently. Softer. Smaller. Like I had become fragile overnight. Friends asked whether I planned to move closer to family as though independence had an expiration date for widows. Even my mother began introducing me at church as "Poor Evelyn," with that dramatic sadness in her voice that made strangers tilt their heads sympathetically. But none of them saw the years before Daniel passed. The years of hospital shifts that stretched 14 hours long. The nights I sat beside his bed tracking medication schedules while pretending not to notice how weak he had become. The grief had nearly hollowed me out afterward, but surviving it also changed something inside me. I no longer wanted a life built entirely around other people's needs. "I need to go into town for a few errands," I said calmly. My mother frowned immediately. "What errands?" The question came too quickly, too naturally, like she was entitled to every detail of my schedule. "Just errands," I repeated. My father checked his watch. "We were planning to visit the marina later. You should come with us. The owner already told us about long-term boat slips nearby." Nearby? Long-term? Every sentence sounded more permanent than the last. I nodded slowly, even though my mind was already somewhere else entirely. Last night after speaking with Mark, I barely slept. I sat awake in my small suburban home, remembering all the moments I ignored over the years because confronting them felt too exhausting. My mother opening my mail when I was younger and calling it concern. My father insisting on access to every bank account after I graduated nursing school because families should not keep secrets. Even after Daniel and I married, They treated our home like an extension of theirs, rearranging cabinets, criticizing furniture, showing up unannounced with overnight bags. Daniel used to joke that my parents believed boundaries were things that happened to other people. At the time I laughed, because laughing was easier than admitting how deeply trapped I felt. But standing on that porch now, something inside me felt strangely clear. My parents had not suddenly become controlling. They had simply reached a point where they no longer bothered hiding it. My mother finished her coffee and stood carefully. "I think I will unpack some kitchen things before lunch," she announced. Unpack. As though the decision was already complete. She disappeared inside, carrying the mug while my father stayed beside me studying the side yard again. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "your mother sacrificed a lot raising you. Most daughters would be grateful to give something back at this stage of life." I finally turned and looked directly at him. Really looked at him. The confident posture. The certainty. The complete inability to imagine I might say no. And suddenly I realized something almost startling in its simplicity. They were not asking because they believed they deserved the house. They were asking because they believed I would never choose myself over them. My father smiled faintly, clearly mistaking my silence for agreement. "This is going to work out nicely for everyone," he said. I smiled back just enough to keep him comfortable. Then I reached into my purse and quietly checked the text message Mark had sent 20 minutes earlier. "The locks will be changed tomorrow morning." The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of waves rolling softly beyond the dunes behind the house. For a few quiet seconds, I forgot my parents were there. I lay still beneath the pale linen sheets listening to the ocean breathe against the shore, and for the first time in days, I felt almost calm. Then I heard my mother's voice downstairs. "Richard, those cabinets are completely impractical." The peace disappeared immediately. I closed my eyes for a moment before sitting up slowly. A thin strip of sunlight stretched across the bedroom floor, while the ceiling fan turned lazily overhead. Daniel would have already been awake by now if he were still here. He always woke early near the water. I could almost picture him standing barefoot on the porch with coffee in one hand, and that faded baseball cap he loved pulled low over his forehead. Some mornings the memory of him felt comforting. Other mornings it felt like someone quietly pressing on a bruise that never fully healed. I dressed quickly and walked downstairs. The smell of bacon filled the kitchen. My father stood at the stove cooking breakfast as though he had lived there for years. My mother sat at the island counter flipping through a local real estate magazine, with reading glasses balanced on the edge of her nose. "Good morning," she said brightly without looking up. "Your father made breakfast." I stopped near the doorway. My kitchen towels had been replaced overnight with hers. A ceramic rooster salt shaker sat beside the stove where my seashell-shaped one used to be. Tiny changes. Tiny invasions. My father slid eggs onto 3 plates. "You should really consider replacing this stove eventually," he said casually. "Gas would work better." I stared at him for one long second before quietly pouring myself coffee instead. "I like the stove." He shrugged. "Well, once we are settled in permanently, we can update things little by little." Permanently. The word no longer shocked me. That was the frightening part. My parents had repeated their plans so many times in 48 hours that they were beginning to speak about them like established facts. My mother folded one corner of the magazine thoughtfully. "There is a lovely antique store near the marina. I saw the perfect dining table yesterday." "Yesterday?" I asked carefully. "You went shopping?" "Just browsing," she replied dismissively. "Although honestly, this house could use warmer furniture. It feels a little cold right now." "Cold?" I nearly laughed at the irony. Every piece inside this house had been chosen carefully. The pale blue sofa Daniel loved. The driftwood lamp I found at a small coastal market. The framed watercolor painting hanging near the staircase that reminded me of our honeymoon in Cape Cod 41 years ago. Nothing about this place was cold. It simply did not belong to them. My phone buzzed quietly against the counter. A message from Mark. "The locksmith arrives at 10. Make sure they are out of the house." I slipped the phone back into my pocket before either of my parents noticed. "I thought we could all go to lunch near the marina today," I said casually while stirring cream into my coffee. "There is a seafood place I wanted to try." My father nodded immediately. "Good idea." My mother smiled faintly. "See? We are already settling into routines." The sentence sat heavily in the air while I forced myself to remain calm. 2 hours later, we drove into town together beneath a cloudless blue sky. Seabrook Cove bustled with weekend tourists carrying beach chairs and shopping bags while music drifted softly from restaurants near the water. My parents seemed completely comfortable walking through town beside me, as though this already belonged to them too. My father greeted strangers confidently. My mother pointed out boutiques she wanted to revisit later. At one point, she stopped outside a small furniture store and squeezed my arm lightly. "Can you imagine a cream-colored china cabinet in your dining room?" she asked. "Your dining room. Not even our dining room anymore." The adjustment in language almost amused me. I smiled politely instead of answering. Lunch stretched longer than expected because my father started talking to another retired couple beside us about fishing conditions along the Gulf. My mother ordered dessert and coffee afterward while discussing local churches she might attend once they relocated. I checked my watch 3 separate times while pretending not to. Finally, nearly 2 hours later, my phone buzzed again beneath the table. Finished. New locks installed. Garage keypad updated. Security system activated. Relief moved quietly through me, so suddenly I almost felt dizzy. Not triumph. Not revenge. Relief. Like finally locking a door during a storm after years of pretending the windows were not open. On the drive back to the house, my mother leaned comfortably against the passenger seat and sighed. I could really get used to this life. I watched the ocean flash silver beside the road as sunlight danced across the water. "I know," I said softly. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized something important. They still believed I was trying to keep the peace. They had no idea I was finally preparing to protect it. The first thing my mother noticed when we returned to the house was the front door lock. She stopped halfway up the porch steps and frowned slightly before trying her key again. The metal clicked uselessly. "That is strange," she murmured. My father stepped beside her and reached for the handle himself. Maybe the lock jammed. I stood a few feet behind them, holding my purse quietly against my side, while warm ocean wind moved through the dunes behind the property. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the porch, making everything look softer than it felt. My mother tried the key a second time, slower this time, confusion tightening around her mouth. "Evelyn," she said without turning around, "what happened to the lock?" "I changed it this morning." Silence settled instantly between us. Even the sound of the ocean seemed farther away for a moment. My father looked over his shoulder sharply. "You did what?" I stepped forward calmly and entered the new code into the keypad beside the door. The lock clicked open immediately. I updated the security system too. I explained evenly while pushing the door open. The old one was outdated. My mother stared at me as though I had slapped her across the face. "Why would you do that without telling us?" There it was again. Us. The assumption that decisions about my home required their approval. I walked inside slowly and set my purse on the kitchen counter before answering. "Because it is my house." The sentence hung heavily in the air. Simple, quiet, but somehow more shocking to them than if I had screamed. My father stepped inside behind me, his jaw tightening visibly. "Nobody said it was not your house." I looked at him carefully. "Actually, both of you have been acting like it belongs to you since the moment you arrived." My mother crossed her arms immediately. "That is ridiculous." "Is it?" My voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "You brought moving boxes here without asking. You replaced furniture. You started planning renovations. You discussed retirement here with strangers before even speaking to me honestly." Neither of them answered right away. My father walked toward the living room windows and stared outside with visible irritation, while my mother remained frozen near the kitchen island. "We are your parents," she finally said quietly, as though that alone explained everything. I leaned lightly against the counter and studied her face. For years that sentence worked like a master key in our family. "We are your parents." Translation: do not question us. Do not resist. Do not make us uncomfortable. But standing there in my own beach house, something inside me refused to shrink this time. "Being my parents does not make you owners of my life," I said softly. My mother's eyes widened slightly. Not because I raised my voice. I did not. The shock came from hearing boundaries spoken aloud at all. My father turned away from the window abruptly. "After everything we have done for you, this is the gratitude we get?" I almost smiled because the script never changed. Guilt always arrived the moment control slipped away. "Dad," I said quietly, "you are talking about gratitude while standing inside a house you tried to claim without permission." His face darkened instantly. "Do not exaggerate." "I am not exaggerating." I gestured toward the boxes stacked near the hallway. You moved belongings into my home before I even agreed to anything. My mother sat down slowly at the kitchen island, suddenly looking older than she had that morning. We just thought, she began before stopping herself. For one brief second, I saw something unexpected flicker across her face. Not guilt exactly. Fear. Fear that the version of me they depended on was disappearing. I poured myself a glass of water while silence stretched between us. The ice cubes clinked softly against the glass. Outside, waves continued rolling toward shore with steady rhythm. My father finally spoke again, but his voice sounded tighter now. So what exactly are you saying? I looked directly at both of them before answering. I am saying you are welcome to visit when invited. But you are not moving into this house. The words settled heavily into the room. My mother blinked several times as though she genuinely could not process what she had heard. My father let out a short laugh, filled with disbelief. You cannot be serious. I am completely serious. His expression hardened immediately. So after all these years, after all our sacrifices, you are choosing a beach house over your own family. I stared at him quietly for a long moment, because that question revealed everything. In his mind, choosing myself automatically meant betraying them. Boundaries felt like cruelty to people who benefited from having none. No, I said softly at last. I am finally choosing peace. My mother looked away first. My father said nothing after that. He simply grabbed his fishing hat from the porch chair and walked outside without another word. Through the window, I watched him disappear toward the dunes with rigid shoulders while the evening sun burned orange across the water behind him. My mother remained seated at the island staring silently at her folded hands. And for the first time in my entire life, I realized something almost unbelievable. They truly never thought I would say no. That night, the house felt strangely quiet after dinner. My father barely spoke while picking at his food, and my mother moved around the kitchen with stiff control. Movements that reminded me of thunderstorms gathering far out over the Gulf before anyone heard the first crack of thunder. Nobody mentioned the conversation from earlier. Nobody apologized either. We existed together inside a silence thick enough to feel physical. After washing my plate, I stepped outside onto the back porch with a cup of tea and sat alone facing the ocean. The sky had turned deep navy blue, and moonlight stretched silver across the water in long shimmering lines. Somewhere down the beach, faint laughter drifted from a nearby bonfire before disappearing into the wind. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and let myself breathe slowly for the first time all day. My entire body felt exhausted. Not from fighting. The strange part was that I had not fought at all. I had simply stopped surrendering. And somehow that felt heavier than years of staying quiet. The porch door slid open behind me. My mother stepped outside carrying a light cardigan around her shoulders. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she sat carefully in the chair beside mine with a soft sigh. Your father is upset, she said finally. I stared at the ocean. I know. You embarrassed him today. I almost laughed at the predictability of it. Not once did she mention my feelings. Not once did she acknowledge how invasive their behavior had been. The concern was still his pride, his comfort, his disappointment. Mom, I said quietly, did either of you ever plan to ask me before moving into this house? She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words. We assumed you would want us here. I nodded slowly. That is not the same thing. The wind lifted strands of her silver hair while she looked down at her folded hands. For the first time since arriving, she suddenly looked tired instead of offended. Older somehow. You do not understand what getting old feels like, she murmured softly. Everything becomes uncertain. Your health, your future, whether anybody still needs you. I turned toward her then because beneath all the control and entitlement, I recognized something painfully familiar. Fear. Not fear of losing the house exactly. Fear of losing relevance. Losing security. Losing the illusion that somebody would always rearrange their life around her needs. I do understand fear, I said gently. I sat beside Daniel while cancer took away pieces of him 1 month at a time. I understand waking up terrified of the future. Her eyes flickered briefly before dropping again. Then how can you be so cold about this? Cold. Another word people use when women stop sacrificing themselves quietly. I set my teacup down carefully beside me. This house was the first decision I ever made completely for myself, I said. Nobody pressured me into it. Nobody approved it for me. I bought it because after 67 years, I finally wanted peace. She looked toward the water without answering. I continued softly. But the moment you arrived, everything became about what you wanted again. The porch remained silent except for the sound of waves crashing gently against shore. Somewhere inside the house, cabinet doors opened and closed while my father moved around upstairs. Finally, my mother spoke again, but her voice sounded smaller now. Your father thought living here would bring the family closer. I looked at her carefully. No, he thought living here would keep control close. The truth settled between us heavily because deep down she knew it was true. My father had spent his entire life needing to feel necessary, important, obeyed, and my role in that system had always been simple. The dependable daughter, the accommodating daughter, the daughter who adjusted herself until everyone else remained comfortable. My mother rubbed one hand slowly against the fabric of her cardigan. You have changed since Daniel passed. I smiled faintly at that because she was right. Grief changes people in strange ways. Some become softer, others become invisible. But somewhere inside all that loneliness, I had quietly learned how short life actually was. Too short to spend the rest of it apologizing for wanting peace. Maybe I finally became honest, I said softly. She stared at me for a long moment before standing slowly from the chair. For just an instant, she looked like she wanted to say something else. Something vulnerable, perhaps. But instead, she simply nodded once and turned toward the house. Halfway to the door, she paused. Your father already told several people we were relocating here, she admitted quietly without facing me. He is going to take this very personally. I watched moonlight ripple across the dark water beyond the dunes. He already did, I replied calmly. After she went inside, I remained on the porch alone for nearly another hour listening to the ocean breathe beneath the night sky. And somewhere between the waves and the silence, I realized something that would have terrified the old version of me. I no longer cared whether setting boundaries disappointed my parents. What frightened me now was the thought of surrendering my peace just to keep them comfortable again. The following morning arrived heavy with tension, so quiet it almost felt polite. My father barely looked at me during breakfast, and my mother moved through the kitchen with careful, controlled motions that reminded me of someone trying not to spill boiling water. The beach house itself seemed to sense the shift too. Even the air felt different, tighter, less welcoming. Outside, gray clouds drifted slowly across the gulf while wind rattled the dune grass behind the property. Around 10 o'clock, my father finally pushed his coffee cup away and cleared his throat. We need to discuss practical matters, he announced. There was that tone again. The one that always meant a decision had already been made somewhere inside his mind. I folded the newspaper resting beside my plate and looked at him calmly. What practical matters? He leaned back in his chair. If we are going to continue this arrangement peacefully, we need clarity about living expenses and responsibilities. Arrangement. The audacity of the word almost impressed me. My mother jumped in before I could answer. Your father is only trying to be reasonable. Reasonable. Another family favorite. In our house growing up, reasonable always meant surrender quietly, so nobody else felt uncomfortable. My father folded his hands across his stomach. Your mother and I could contribute toward groceries and utilities, of course. But larger expenses like taxes and maintenance should stay under your responsibility since the property is technically yours. Technically yours. I stared at him for several long seconds while something cold and clear settled fully into place inside me. Even now, after I explicitly told them they were not moving in, they still believed this was negotiable. They thought resistance was temporary, a mood, a phase I would eventually apologize for. There is no arrangement, I said quietly. My father's expression hardened immediately. Evelyn. No, I interrupted gently. You both keep speaking as though this discussion is still open. It is not. Silence spread across the kitchen. Outside the window, palm trees bent slightly beneath the growing wind. My mother looked down at her untouched toast, while my father stared at me with visible disbelief. You are being unbelievably selfish, he said at last. The old guilt might have worked on me years ago. It would have ruined entire weeks of my life once. I would have replayed every sentence afterward wondering whether I had been unfair, whether I owed them more patience, more understanding, more sacrifice. But grief changes your relationship with time. After watching someone you love disappear piece by piece, you stop wasting years trying to earn approval that never comes. I spent most of my life doing what made everyone else comfortable, I replied softly. And somehow it was still never enough. My father shook his head sharply. That is not true. I almost smiled at that because it was painfully true. I remembered missing a college trip because my parents needed help paying bills. I remembered working extra hospital shifts while my younger brother traveled through Europe without criticism because boys need freedom. I remembered my mother crying the first time Daniel and I discussed moving out of state for better jobs. Families stay close, she said back then. Translation, your life belongs near ours. You have always expected me to build my life around your needs, I said quietly. And the moment I stopped, suddenly I became selfish. My mother's eyes glistened slightly then, but even now I could not tell whether the emotion came from sadness or wounded pride. We are getting older, she whispered. We thought family was supposed to help each other. I nodded slowly. Helping is not the same as surrendering my life. My father stood abruptly from the table and walked toward the living room windows. Rain had started falling lightly outside, tapping softly against the glass while dark waves rolled beneath the cloudy sky beyond the dunes. I already told people we were relocating here, he muttered bitterly without turning around. There it was again. Not embarrassment over crossing boundaries. Embarrassment that his assumptions turned out wrong publicly. My mother rubbed her temples tiredly. Richard, but he kept staring out the window. Harold already invited us to his fishing club next month. His voice sounded smaller suddenly. Older. For the first time since this began, I saw not just entitlement, but humiliation. My father built his identity around authority for so long that rejection felt personal to him. Especially from me. I stood slowly from the table and carried my coffee mug to the sink. You should not have made promises about a house that was never yours, I said gently. Neither of them answered. Rain continued falling steadily outside while silence filled the kitchen again. Then my phone buzzed softly on the counter. A message from Mark. Everything is finalized. Rental agreement approved. You are protected now. Relief moved through me so quietly, it almost felt like grief itself finally loosening its grip around my chest. I slipped the phone back into my pocket while my parents sat silently at the table behind me. They still did not understand what was coming next. They thought this was a family disagreement. They had no idea I was already building a future where my peace no longer depended on their approval. 3 days later, the rain finally passed, and the Gulf returned to its usual calm rhythm beneath a bright blue sky. Sunlight spilled across the water in glittering ribbons, while seabirds drifted lazily above the shoreline. From the outside, the beach house looked peaceful again. But inside, tension still lingered quietly in every room. My parents barely spoke to me now unless absolutely necessary. My father spent most of his time outside walking along the marina or sitting silently on the porch staring at the ocean with wounded pride written across his face. My mother retreated into long phone calls with relatives back in Savannah, her voice low and careful whenever I entered the room. I knew exactly what was happening. The family narrative was already being rewritten. Evelyn changed after Daniel died. Evelyn became distant. Evelyn pushed her parents away. Families like ours survive by protecting appearances, even when the truth rots quietly underneath them. That morning, I woke early and drove into town alone before either of my parents came downstairs. The air smelled like salt and sunscreen while tourists wandered through the small shops near the marina carrying beach towels and iced coffee. I parked beside a white stucco building overlooking the harbor and sat inside the car for a moment watching sailboats rock gently against their slips in the water below. Then I stepped out and walked inside. Mark was already waiting for me in the conference room with a folder resting neatly beside his coffee cup. "Morning," he said gently. I sat across from him and looked out through the large windows facing the Gulf. "I barely slept last night." He nodded knowingly. Major decisions usually feel heavier right before peace arrives. Peace. The word still sounded fragile to me somehow, like something beautiful that could disappear if I reached for it too quickly. Mark opened the folder and slid several documents across the table toward me. "Everything is finalized," he explained. "The beach house is now fully protected under the trust structure we discussed, and the seasonal rental agreement officially begins next month." I looked down at the papers carefully. My signature sat neatly across the bottom page beneath the legal details. 6-month luxury coastal rental. Fully managed property services included. No long-term residency claims permitted. My parents could not take over the house now even if they tried. Not legally. Not emotionally. not through guilt. I still cannot believe I am doing this, I admitted softly. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair. You are not selling your piece anymore, Evelyn. That just feels unfamiliar. We sat quietly for a moment while sunlight reflected across the marina outside. Then he asked the question I had been avoiding asking myself. What happens with your parents now? I looked out toward the water again before answering. They go home. The words felt strangely calm, leaving my mouth. Not cruel, not angry, simply true. An hour later, I returned to the beach house carrying a paper bag with fresh pastries from the bakery near the harbor. The smell of cinnamon and butter filled the kitchen as I set the bag onto the counter. My mother appeared first, followed by my father several minutes later. Neither looked particularly pleased to see me. I poured coffee quietly into 3 mugs before finally speaking. I met with Mark this morning. My father immediately stiffened. Why? Because I finalized plans for the property. Silence settled instantly over the kitchen. My mother looked nervous now, while my father's expression hardened into suspicion. What plans? He asked carefully. I folded my hands lightly around my coffee mug before answering. The house will become a seasonal luxury rental starting next month. My mother blinked several times. A rental? I nodded calmly. Yes, professionally managed. Fully booked through spring already. My father stared at me in disbelief. You are renting out the house instead of letting your own parents live here. I am protecting the life I worked for, I replied softly. And I realized something important recently. Neither of them spoke. This house was supposed to become the first peaceful chapter of my life. I continued quietly. But the moment you arrived, I started feeling small inside it. My mother looked down immediately, while my father remained frozen beside the counter. I do not want to spend the rest of my life negotiating for space inside my own happiness. The kitchen remained completely silent except for the distant sound of waves beyond the dunes. Finally, my father let out a slow breath and looked away first. Not angry anymore, just defeated, older somehow. My mother sat down carefully at the table, her shoulders slumping beneath the weight of everything left unsaid between us. So that is it? She asked quietly. I looked at both of them for a long moment before answering. No, you are still my parents. But I am finally my own person too. Late that afternoon, after they packed their things into the silver sedan and drove away beneath the fading Florida sunlight, I walked alone down to the shoreline behind the house. The sand felt cool beneath my bare feet, while gentle waves rolled steadily onto shore. Seagulls drifted overhead against the pale orange sky as the sun slowly lowered toward the horizon. For years, I thought peace meant keeping everyone else comfortable, keeping conversations smooth, keeping disappointments hidden, keeping myself small enough to fit inside other people's expectations. But standing there beside the ocean with the wind moving softly through my hair and nobody demanding anything from me at all, I finally understood the truth. Peace was never something my family could give me. It was something I had to choose for myself.